My imagination can't come up with some of the cool things that science actually does. It's not like it's impossible, it just hasn't been discovered yet. So I'm hoping that some kid will pick up my book and get so inspired and become a space scientist and figure out how to do this.
H.M. Waugh is a children's author, educator and environmental scientist with a long-term love of wild places and outdoor adventures. She's been kidnapped twice, handles dragons for a job, and dreams of one day blasting into space. Her books mix humour, danger and friendship with a dash of science and imagination. Her debut book was a finalist for the Aurealis Award, and her second novel was a CBCA notable book. Her new sci-fi duology starts in 2022 with Mars Awakens. Overcoming adversity, apparently, to be here today, I welcome H.M. Waugh to the stage.
I think it is on. Thank you so much for that. If anyone's wondering what my adversity is, it's almost like a really good adversity because I dropped my laptop. Oh no, but I dropped it on my foot. Hooray! But then my foot started bleeding. Oh no! And then I had to drive the car down here pressing the clutch in all the time. And so I'm like, oh, my foot. I don't even want to take my shoe off and look at what's happening under there. This is so cool to be here. I'm so glad that I'm a part of this because you're in a room with people full of sci-fi love, which is really cool. Thank you, Angela, for that beautiful intro. As she said, my name is H.M. Waugh. Do feel free to call me Heather. It's a long story why I'm an H.M. But yeah, we're going to talk the science in science fiction. And I actually put science in all of my fiction. I get really inspired by it. I think science can inspire fiction and science fiction can inspire science as well. We're going to specifically talk about terraforming Mars because that's cool. And if you don't think it is, you're about to figure it out. This picture up here is not Mars. This is the Pilbara region of Western Australia. But when I was doing a fictional terraforming process of Mars myself, I drew from reality, and I figured that Mars, if we did terraform it, if we did manage to make it, a breathable planet with plants growing, I reckon it would look like a really cold Pilbara. So that's what I went with. All right. Very quickly on me, those are my 3 books out at the moment. Only one of them is technically science fiction, which is Mars Awakens on the right there. But all of them use science and inject science in because I am a scientist. So I think there's fewer weird things in the world than what science can show you. Imagination, my imagination can't come up with some of the cool things that science actually does, that's actually real out there at the moment. Okay, so Mars Awakens is why we're terraforming Mars this morning, because it's set on a terraformed Mars of the future. So I had to go through, it was so hard. I had to go through all the research of the science behind how we would do that and how it might work out. So let's look into the science behind science fiction. That is me on Mars. Yeah, I'm not even wearing a spacesuit. Don't know how that works. If you don't believe me, there's my ticket. Totally went there. If you're ever looking for procrastination moments, you can go onto the NASA website and do some really cool things. But I suppose this is up there just to say that I am a massive space geek. I've really loved space since early on in my childhood when I started to read sci-fi novels and things like that. I am not a space scientist. So with some of what I'm doing here, I am loving space science, and I'm being inspired by space science, but if you have a really technical question, I might not know the answer. Because I'm an environmental scientist instead. I'm more about plants, ecosystem restoration, that sort of thing. Okay, why Mars? That could be the first question. When we're looking at, where is the next step for humans in our solar system? Quite often in sci-fi and in like science, we are looking at Mars as our option. But there's lots of other things out there. I don't know if you've got any kids and you've ever had to learn Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and then I always think Pluto, because I'm that old that Pluto used to be a planet. We've got lots of planets out there. So why is it that NASA, SpaceX, all these people are currently saying it's Mars and we're going there in the 2030s? You know, we're going to send people to Mars. It actually used to be Venus, like a long time ago. People looked at Venus and they're like, same size as Earth. This looks like a good planet, we'll go here. And then they quickly figured out that Venus was really, really, really hot. And its clouds are made of sulfuric acid. So they kind of went, you know what? I don't think it's Venus anymore. Interestingly enough, there's like all this contention as to whether Venus is in that Goldilocks zone that scientists look for, that space from the sun, distance from the sun, that means that a planet might be habitable, might be able to be terraformed, or might even have life already. But I go on the side that Venus is totally in the region, but it's not quite our life that we're looking at there. So that's when Venus became, like they put it to the side, that's when Mars came forward and they're like, well, yeah, maybe we're gonna do Mars. But the interesting thing is about 2 years ago, the science came out where a scientist decided to look at the clouds on Venus. Okay, and these clouds are about a constant 30 degrees Celsius. So the surface, way too hot. The sulfuric acid clouds, 30 degrees. And there are things that they started finding, this chemical they started finding in the clouds, that on Earth, sure, they can be made by synthetic things like asteroids and lightning and stuff like that. But that we could only account, or I say we, that's like the royal we, I didn't do the science. They can only account for like 1/10,000th of it from natural sources, like from non-biological sources. And the other thing is, it keeps getting broken down by acid. So to have the levels that they're finding there, it means that something is continually producing this. And on Earth, there are actually bacteria that produce this chemical, and they live in highly acid, low oxygen environments, like in the bottom of the ocean and things like that. So potentially we discarded Venus as having life, but maybe it has life, just not the sort of life we were expecting to be finding. So I think science is awesome in terms of that. But no, we're not going to Venus. We're not even going to Jupiter's moons today. Lots of sci-fi put themselves on Jupiter's moons. And in fact, Ganymede is a really cool moon, and I'll discuss it a bit later in terms of wanting to be terraformed kind of thing. Space stations, lots of sci-fi built space stations. Personally, I think that eventually the space station might start rusting and falling apart. Whereas a planet, I think it's really cool. As long as you can get it working, it's going to stay in its orbit and it's going to do its thing, and you can live quite safely on that planet. So Mars, it's rocky. It has kind of a little bit of atmosphere. It's a lot colder than Earth, but it's got that possibility of being an awesome place for us to go. Okay, so can we terraform Mars? And I'm not talking about the board game, which if you haven't found it, you should, because like science fiction isn't just books and movies and stuff, it's also board games. I terraform Mars every time I play the board game. I never win, personally. My daughter usually beats me. But yeah, not talking that. We're talking real science. Can we do it? And the answer is not yet. And so when I wrote my book in the acknowledgements, I actually put this out here. Look, there are reasons that we can't do, we can't make the Mars that I've got in my book here. But the science, it's not like it's impossible, it just hasn't been discovered yet. So I'm hoping that some kid will pick up my book and get so inspired and become a space scientist and figure out how to do this, because science is awesome. And just because we can't do it yet doesn't mean that we just can't do it. So at the moment, what is in our way? Two rather big and expensive things. The first being a magnetic field, and the second being an atmosphere, which, so picky. Who needs to breathe, right? Okay, science that we need to fix, all right? Number one, we need to make a global magnetic field. This is a really cool illustration. It's not what it looks like, that octopus, though it does give me really good ideas for like a story where this giant space octopus is swallowing planets or something. But basically, a magnetic field sits around the planet, and it's kind of like being in a rainstorm with your umbrella and the rain comes around and falls all around you. This magnetic field sits around Earth and it diverts most of the solar radiation and the cosmic radiation so it doesn't hit our planet. And if it was to hit our planet, we would literally be fried. It would just be too much. We'd have DNA damage, we'd have cell death. We can't survive if there was no electromagnetic field around the Earth. So the other thing it also does is there's things called solar winds, which I think is such a cool concept, where the sun sort of sends out this burst of particles, charged particles, that actually rip away atmosphere. And if we didn't have this shield, this field around our Earth, then we'd lose our atmosphere as well. So it's a pretty cool thing to have. And interestingly, the International Space Station is within that field. So when they go up there, they don't have the protection of our atmosphere, but they still have the protection of this field around them. Mars doesn't have it anymore, which I think is really cool. So Mars once did have it, which is why they're really keenly looking to see if there once was life on Mars. And in fact, there's like leftovers of it in the southern hemisphere, which at first you're like, well, this is cool, we could build a little place down there, but it keeps on moving and popping around, and so it's not really helpful. That's the reason why Mars has no atmosphere anymore. It's lost a lot of its water, which they do believe quite seriously it had a lot before. That's because the solar winds have been ripping it all away. So we could like make an atmosphere on Mars and be really proud of ourselves, and then without a field, it's just all going to be lost again. There is a lot of science out there on how we can fix this. Apparently we could put like a ring of like plasma charged particle things. Don't quote me on that. And that would actually work as a field around Mars. And the other thing they think that we can do is we could actually put almost like a little dipole, a charged dipole out between the sun and Mars, and that could act as an artificial field. So they're looking into how we can do this quite seriously at the moment, which I think is really cool. So presuming that they're going to fix it, what's the other thing we need? We need an atmosphere, and I personally love this GIF because this is Mars. This is dust devils on Mars in the Jezero crater, which I just think is amazing. There's wind, there's air there. It's just not enough. It's about 1% of Earth. And that means even though it's really, 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 really cold, if I was to go to Mars and stand without a spacesuit, my eyes would boil, my saliva would boil immediately. Not hot boil, it's just because there's no pressure. And as I breathe in, all the water in my lungs would boil away as well, and that means I'm dead. So not very good. But I hear you say, I've played the game Terraforming Mars, and all I have to do is like get stuff. You know, carbon dioxide is frozen at the poles, I can just melt that. And there's water and there's, you know, carbon in rock. Apparently, that's only going to get us to 7% of the atmosphere that Earth has. So it's not quite working. But I hear you say, what about the asteroids that I can throw at the surface and bring stuff from outside Mars and land it into Mars? But apparently we'd need thousands of them to pummel the surface in order to get enough atmosphere for us to be safe. And to put this in comparison, like if you were climbing Everest and you're up in the death zone at the very top, that's about 33% of the pressure of sea level. So when we've got pressures down at like 1 or 7%, it's not healthy. So at the moment, this is a struggle. In my book, I decided to invent a fusion process because a lot of people talk about fusion as a potential way to restart, to kickstart the center of Mars, which could potentially also give it that magnetic field as well. And you know, I made my fusion process kind of tunnel through the bedrock and burn up a lot of that bedrock and create carbon, because it's quite a lot of high carbon rock there. Yeah, I made that up because that's why it's called science fiction. Because I wanted to terraform Mars, because I think it's really cool. If we then jump into the realms of science fiction and think, well, if we had this magnetic field and we had the atmosphere that we could breathe, so we're able to put people on Mars and they don't need to have all the protective gear, what would we need to then do? Because at the moment, that means we've got an atmosphere, probably not much oxygen. It's really, really cold, and there's nothing alive. And in fact, sorry to break it to you, the soil is highly toxic. So everyone who's watched The Martian, when he makes the potatoes, he can't do it, we don't think, because there's so much of this toxicity. I think they're perchlorates in the actual soil. And in fact, that's so toxic that bacteria that can survive on a spaceship all the way from Earth to Mars, when they add it to soil with that high level of perchlorate, these like super bacteria die. That's how toxic it is. But there is a cool solution. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to warm it up, all right, because it's freezing. And to warm it up, we need that atmosphere. So once we've got the atmosphere, that's almost like a tick, because it's this big rug around us, and it can help that planet to warm up. Sometimes I look at this and I think, well, Mars is too cold and it doesn't have enough carbon. We're currently, dealing with climate change, and we've got too much carbon. We gotta find a solution here. We could just share some of our carbon across to our neighbor, who knows? So once we've warmed it up with that atmosphere, reflecting our heat back down, the high levels of carbon that we've put into that atmosphere, our sun itself is actually warming as we go through its life. So we are going to end up with natural warming as well for Mars. Then we can start to think about making some more oxygen. Here's where the cool stuff comes in. Remember that toxic soil that you're all like, oh no, what are we gonna do? Apparently there's an enzyme that will break that toxicity down, and its waste product is oxygen. Allah. So I reckon we do that first. Then we've got to plant, and this is like one of my favorite sci-fi tropes, then we've got to plant some sort of really cold tolerant grass or something, seed it across, broad scale seeding over the whole planet. I just love it when there's a book or a movie that is just based on this like planet that's just covered in grass. I don't know why, it's a thing I love. So yeah, it's got to be a really tough grass, I would say. I chose a grass because they don't need anything else to produce their seed to keep on reproducing. They just need wind. And what has Mars got? A lot of wind, lots of wind. So you would need the grass, but you also need bacteria. When I was trying to rehabilitate mine sites, if we had waste tailings that had come from deep beneath the ground, the rehab there would fail because there was nothing alive in the top of that rehab for the seeds to hold on to. They might sprout and germinate, but then they couldn't go any further. So we needed to have that kind of magic humus, that topsoil, the bacteria that keep everything alive. So I reckon we're spreading some bacteria at the same time as we're spreading grass seed. So then we've got a warm planet with lots of oxygen. What do we need next? We need some ecosystem balance. We need a few more things because humans can't live off grass. As far as I'm aware, it doesn't really work very well. So you got to add things in. Really expensive, I reckon, to ship stuff from Earth to Mars. So why not grow things on Mars that could actually help our population? So we're thinking food crops, things that you can turn into materials for building and construction, that sort of stuff. So I actually spent a lot of time geeking out on what plants I would grow on Mars in my Mars of the Future. And like one of the top ones that came out was harakeke, which is New Zealand flax, because you can make fabrics, ropes, oils, all sorts of things out of this one really tough, pretty cold tolerant plant. So yeah, you got to think about what plants are going to take over from the grasses, because once it starts warming up too much, some of those really cold tolerant grasses that probably we've modified genetically to withstand the cold, it's going to get too warm for them. So you need something to take over. The other thing you need is a bit of a food chain, because otherwise you've just got this kind of a monoculture, I suppose. So you need something for humans to eat. And I was like, well, I could put a cow on there or something, but that's a little bit too big. We could just eat vegetable protein, but then we don't have that food chain, because the vegetables, like the beans, aren't going to be eating the other plants unless it's really gone weird on Mars, which is also another cool idea I've just come up with. So what could we do? I actually decided on crickets, because crickets are highly palatable. They're actually really tasty. Humans can eat them. They're really high in protein. They are considered one of the futures of protein for humans here on Earth. Crickets can eat the plants. When the crickets die, their stuff goes into the soil and it makes better humus, and the plants are happier, so the crickets can eat more of the plants, and we can eat the crickets and the plants. And if they get too many crickets, they start eating themselves. So they don't actually get too overrun. I thought that was a pretty good solution. But basically, you would need to make sure that you have a really balanced environment. If you think about here on Earth, if you've got like an area that was cleared, ages ago and it's had whatever housing and now the house has been knocked down and you just leave that, it just becomes like a weed zone, doesn't it? And it's not actually providing much for us or for the animals, native animals around it. So you need to be quite specific about what you would be putting out there to make sure that it is balanced and no one thing takes over, unless that one thing is something that's really awesome that we can use as settlers. All right, hopefully, once you've done all of those things, Mars stops looking like this and starts looking a bit more like this, which is what I imagine my Mars looking like. And again, it's the Pilbara. I worked up there for quite a few years and I am a little bit in love with it. All right, so that is basically, me at the end, hoping from my side as a writer and an imaginer, as well as a scientist, that we can, at some point in human history, turn that into something that's more like that, and spread out to a new realm. I don't know, sci-fi where they go to new planets, that's my jam. I just love it when that happens, and hopefully it can happen in real life as well. So thank you. I think, are we stealing back time, or do we take a few questions now?
I think we probably should take a couple of questions. What do you think, gents? Yeah? Yeah, has anyone got a question? Right up the back, of course you are. Here I come.
What's your marvellous time frame?
I have no marvellous time frame. I very carefully didn't put a time in my book because I don't know when that will happen. All it takes is one aha moment and you've suddenly turned it from not optional to being available. I think once we get to the point where we've got an atmosphere and it's warm enough, then that is still many generations that you would need before you had a planet that was stable enough for people to be living there, without the gear and everything. But certainly the 2030s, we're going to be going there. So our kids, grandkids, if you've got them, they've got the option that, for me, I wanted to be an astronaut, and then I figured out that I couldn't get my pilot's license because my eyes weren't perfect. And when I was about 15, I was like, oh my God, my life, what am I going to do now? Became an environmental scientist, even more cool. But nowadays, the next generations, they've got so much more opportunity to head to space and become part of something so much bigger. All right. We've got one just in front of the other person.
I don't know if you know, but when you were talking about crickets, would they survive the flight to Mars?
Oh, you know what? I never considered them coming across alive. I reckon, personally, looking at my backyard, they'd survive a lot. Because you're like, it's really cold today, and what is that chirping? I don't know if you'd want that chirping in your spaceship all the way across for a year. I don't know. But I presume that they would be in some sort of a egg form stasis that you would then bring out and put into, like a cube, like they do farm them at the moment. And you can farm crickets on like waste vegetables and fruit. So it's actually a really good way to, not use resources. If they're not destined for humans, then we can actually use them for crickets. So hopefully that'll work. But yeah, good question. How do we get them there? How do we get everything there? That's the big one.
Take one more question and then we'll save the rest for the panel.
Quite a nice one now. How do you reconcile climate change against terraforming Mars? Because on Earth it's a no-no to change our climate, but on Mars we are possibly changing the environment to suit human life.
This is where I love sci-fi because it's got ethics. What if there actually is life on Mars? Who gets to choose what's intelligent? If we'd gone like, oh, Venus has got nothing. Well, maybe it's got some cool dudes in like kingdoms floating around in sulfuric acid clouds, Who are we to judge? So yeah, I love the ethical dilemma that comes with science fiction because we have, it inspires me, but we have things that are happening on Mars at the moment that we're recording that are potentially caused by biological activity that is just at a level we don't understand for it to still be alive. They have spikes of methane. They've got types of rock that are usually produced by biological activity here on Earth that they're finding. So maybe there is something there, and if we terraform it, it may go extinct. Spoilers? My goodness. In my book, there may theoretically be a single-celled, native, very intelligent species that is struggling to continue to survive in its original home, potentially. I'm saying no more. But yes, that's the ethical question. Who are we to choose that a planet is better off being terraformed? You know? Oh, I never mentioned Ganymede has its own its own magnetic field. We could go there as well. But then what if there's creatures on Ganymede? That's one of Jupiter's moons. Yeah, who knows?
Let's show our thanks to Heather.